Marcus, step away from the counter.
What's going on?
You recognize these serial numbers?
No.
For nearly a decade, Marcus Johnson was a familiar face in the local electronics resale business. Customers trusted him, suppliers worked with him, and his pawn shop appeared to be thriving. But investigators would eventually allege that thousands of stolen devices had passed through his store, turning a successful business into the center of a massive criminal case.
They came from 3 burglary
For
reports.
nearly a
I buy
decade,
inventory legally.
Marcus Johnson
Why are they
was
logged
known
under fake
as a
sellers?
hardworking
I'm a lawyer.
small business
Black pawn shop owner
His
Marcus
pawn
Turner.
shop sat on the corner of East Franklin Avenue and North 12th Street, in a mid-sized city where word of mouth mattered. The storefront wasn't impressive. The sign above the entrance showed signs of age. The fluorescent lighting inside buzzed softly. Glass display cases lined the floor. Shelves were packed with laptops, gaming consoles, tablets, cameras, and smartphones. But business was good. On most afternoons, customers moved steadily through the store. Some were looking for bargains. Others needed quick cash. Many were repeat customers who knew Marcus by name. At 46 years old, Marcus had built a reputation as a reliable entrepreneur. According to local business filings, he had owned the store for years and expanded its inventory well beyond traditional pawn jewelry and tools. Electronics had become the backbone of the operation. Former customers later described him as approachable and professional. One customer recalled seeing Marcus help elderly residents transfer photos from broken phones. Another remembered him sponsoring a youth basketball fundraiser. Local event flyers occasionally listed the store as a small community sponsor. Nothing about the business appeared unusual, at least not at first. Pawn shops occupy a unique position in the retail world. Every transaction is supposed to create a paper trail. Sellers provide identification. Items are logged. Serial numbers are recorded. Transaction records are uploaded into databases accessible to law enforcement. The system exists for a reason. When a burglary victim reports a stolen laptop or gaming console, investigators can search those databases and determine whether the item was later sold to a pawn shop. The entire process depends on accurate reporting and trust. Inside Marcus's store, employees followed familiar routines. New inventory arrived daily. Clerks entered information into aging desktop computers behind the counter. Receipts printed from thermal printers. Security cameras watched the sales floor from ceiling corners. By all appearances, the business was operating normally. Then small inconsistencies began appearing. In late spring, detectives from the Property Crimes Unit recovered a stolen tablet connected to a residential burglary. The device had been reported missing less than 48 hours earlier. Database records showed it had already passed through Marcus's store. That discovery wasn't alarming by itself. Pawn shops routinely receive stolen property without realizing it. The system is designed to catch those situations. A few weeks later, another case appeared. This time it was a gaming console taken during a vehicle break-in. Again, records pointed to the same business. Investigators noted the recovery and moved on. Then another device surfaced, and another. Over the following months, reports continued arriving. Individually, each recovery seemed explainable. Together, they began attracting attention. Inside the Property Crimes Unit, detectives started noticing the same store name appearing repeatedly in reports crossing their desks. Under fluorescent lights and surrounded by stacks of case files, investigators quietly began comparing notes. No formal investigation existed yet, just questions. The first clue wasn't dramatic. It was statistical. The same business appeared too often. As reports accumulated, detectives began flagging transactions connected to stolen phones, tablets, laptops, and gaming systems. The numbers remained small enough to avoid immediate alarm, but large enough to create discomfort. The pattern didn't make sense, and that discomfort would soon become the foundation of a much larger investigation. Detective Andrew Keller was among the first investigators to look closer. Working alongside crime analysts, he began reviewing theft reports against pawn transaction databases. What started as a routine comparison quickly became something more concerning. Serial numbers from unrelated theft cases repeatedly matched items processed through Marcus's shop. Some originated from residential burglaries across different neighborhoods. Others came from retail theft investigations. Several were connected to package thefts reported miles apart. On paper, the cases had no connection. The victims didn't know one another. The suspects were different. The locations varied. Yet the stolen property kept leading investigators back to the same storefront. Analysts created spreadsheets mapping recovered electronics to transaction records. Rows multiplied, dates lined up, patterns emerged. The evidence room became increasingly busy. Detectives printed reports and pinned timelines to bulletin boards. Computer monitors displayed transaction histories. The HVAC system hummed overhead as investigators worked through records line by line. At first, they considered coincidence. Then the numbers continued growing. What drew attention wasn't just the volume of stolen electronics. It was who was selling them. Transaction logs revealed recurring names appearing again and again. Several individuals had sold large quantities of electronics over extended periods. Some had prior theft-related arrests. Others appeared in police intelligence databases connected to property crime investigations. The same sellers kept returning. The same store kept buying. And the same categories of stolen devices kept resurfacing. That detail changed the conversation. Investigators were no longer asking whether stolen property occasionally entered the store. They were asking whether warning signs had been ignored. Interviews with former employees added more questions. One former clerk described transactions that felt rushed. Another recalled instances where customers arrived carrying multiple phones still linked to active accounts. According to interview summaries, some employees privately questioned whether all merchandise was legitimate, but nobody reported concerns. Some assumed management had verified ownership. Others simply focused on completing transactions. The problem was that nobody seemed willing to challenge the process. As detectives dug deeper, they reviewed store procedures against regulatory requirements. Certain records appeared incomplete. Some descriptions lacked detail. A handful of transactions raised questions about whether standard verification steps had been followed consistently. None of it proved criminal intent, but it suggested possible gaps. And those gaps were beginning to form a pattern. Meanwhile, Marcus continued operating the business. Customers still entered daily. Inventory still moved. Nothing on the sales floor suggested investigators were quietly assembling files behind the scenes. The public saw a successful pawn shop. Detectives were beginning to see something else. By the end of the review, investigators had compiled enough information to open a formal intelligence file focused on the store's electronics transactions. The decision was made quietly. No edits, no public statements, no search warrants, just a growing collection of reports, spreadsheets, transaction logs, and unanswered questions. And buried inside those records was a discovery that would soon push the investigation into an entirely different category. Detectives were beginning to suspect they weren't looking at a few isolated stolen phones. They might be looking at thousands. Before investigators could answer the growing questions surrounding Marcus Johnson's pawn shop, they needed something more concrete than patterns. Recovered devices and recurring sellers had raised concerns, but concerns alone were not enough. Detectives needed documentation. They needed timelines. They needed records that could survive scrutiny in a courtroom. That was when the investigation expanded beyond the property crimes unit. Financial investigators were brought into the case. Inside a county administration building several miles from the pawn shop, analysts began reviewing legal requests for records. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Printers fed out pages of transaction histories. Detectives moved between desks carrying folders filled with case numbers, theft reports, and inventory logs. What started as a property crime investigation was becoming something much larger. Over the next several weeks, investigators obtained bank records, supplier documentation, inventory databases, transaction histories, and electronic reporting submissions connected to the business. The volume of information was overwhelming. Thousands of transactions stretched across multiple years. Analysts built spreadsheets designed to reconstruct the life cycle of individual devices. A stolen phone reported by a victim, a transaction logged by the store, a resale date, A final purchaser. One device at a time. One transaction at a time. The process was slow, but the results were beginning to tell a story. Digital forensic specialists joined the investigation to focus on electronics data. Using serial numbers, activation records, manufacturer databases, and resale histories, they attempted to track where devices originated and where they eventually ended up. Some devices had clean histories. Others did not. In several cases, investigators discovered electronics appearing in the store's inventory only days after they had been reported stolen. The timing immediately attracted attention. Detectives began building side-by-side timelines. Theft reports appeared in one column. Inventory purchases appeared in another. As more data was entered, the gaps between thefts and purchases often became surprisingly short, sometimes just a few days, occasionally less than 24 hours. That detail did not prove criminal intent, but it made coincidence harder to explain. As records accumulated, another issue emerged. Inventory volume. According to transaction records, the store was acquiring electronics at a pace that appeared unusually high compared to similar businesses in the area. Phones, tablets, gaming systems, and laptops flowed through the inventory system in large numbers. Investigators wanted to know why. Some of the answer appeared in transaction logs. The same individuals continued appearing throughout the records. Certain sellers returned repeatedly over extended periods, bringing in significant quantities of electronics. Several had prior arrests for theft-related offenses. Others had previously been named in police reports connected to burglary investigations. Yet transactions continued. Again and again. Detectives reviewed identification records, signatures, timestamps, and inventory entries. They compared them against law enforcement databases. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. One analyst later described the process as watching the same names appear everywhere. The more records investigators reviewed, the more familiar those names became. Attention then shifted toward the money. Bank statements were compared against inventory purchases and resale activity. Investigators attempted to determine whether questionable acquisitions translated into measurable profits. The numbers suggested they did. Records appear to show electronics being acquired at unusually low prices before being resold for significantly higher amounts. The profit margins varied, but the overall trend remained consistent. Investigators began examining whether financial incentives may have encouraged employees or management to overlook warning signs that should have triggered additional scrutiny. That question became increasingly important because the investigation was no longer focused solely on stolen property. It was beginning to focus on decision-making. Inside interview rooms, detectives spoke with former employees. Most described normal workplace routines, inventory processing, customer transactions, end-of-day paperwork. But some remembered moments that stood out. One employee recalled customers arriving with multiple unopened electronic devices. Another remembered occasions when questions about ownership seemed unusually brief. A third described situations where staff members privately expressed concerns but never escalated them. When asked why, the answer was often the same. Nobody wanted to create problems. The business was successful. Transactions moved quickly. People assumed somebody else had verified everything. That assumption would later become a major issue. As investigators continued digging through records, they found inconsistencies that appeared small individually but became significant when viewed collectively. Some inventory descriptions lacked detail. Certain entries contained incomplete information. Several transactions appeared inconsistent with recommended reporting practices. Again, none of these issues alone established criminal conduct, but together they suggested weaknesses in oversight, weaknesses that could potentially be exploited. By late summer, investigators had assembled enough documentation to begin mapping relationships between theft reports, sellers, inventory purchases, and resale activity. Large evidence boards appeared inside the investigative workspace. Colored markers connected names, dates, devices, addresses, transaction numbers. The room grew increasingly crowded with information, and the picture becoming visible on those boards was troubling. What had once looked like isolated incidents now appeared interconnected. Investigators were no longer asking whether stolen electronics occasionally entered the store. They were asking whether the operation had become a reliable destination for them. Meanwhile, Marcus continued operating the business. Customers entered through the front door. Sales continued. Inventory moved across display shelves. Publicly, nothing had changed. Privately, detectives were preparing for the next phase. Documentation had established patterns. Financial records had revealed incentives. Transaction histories had connected individuals to devices. Digital forensic analysis had strengthened timelines. The evidence ladder was advancing. Clue by clue, record by record. The investigation was no longer built on suspicion alone. It was being built on documented relationships between people, property, and money. But investigators still lacked something critical. They needed to see what was happening in real time. Because if their theory was correct, the records only showed the aftermath. The actual transactions were still occurring. And what surveillance teams captured next would become the turning point of the entire case. The investigation had reached a point where paperwork alone was no longer enough. Detectives had transaction histories. They had financial records. They had timelines connecting theft reports to inventory purchases. But prosecutors needed something stronger. They needed to see how business was actually being conducted inside the store. In early September, investigators moved into the surveillance phase. The operation was deliberately quiet. No uniforms, no marked vehicles, no indication that the business had become the focus of a growing criminal investigation. On most mornings, surveillance teams arrived before the store opened. Unmarked sedans parked along nearby side streets. Investigators rotated shifts to avoid attracting attention. From a distance, the operation looked ordinary. A parked vehicle, a person reading a newspaper, someone drinking coffee inside a car. In reality, every movement around the pawn shop was being documented. Investigators tracked opening times, customer traffic, delivery activity, and recurring visitors. Logs were maintained throughout the day. Timestamps recorded arrivals and departures. Vehicle descriptions were entered into reports. At first, observations appeared routine. Then familiar faces began appearing. Several individuals previously identified through transaction records returned repeatedly. Some arrived carrying backpacks. Others carried shopping bags, plastic containers, or boxes. A few arrived with electronics visible in their hands. Investigators noted the frequency. One individual appeared at the store 4 times within 11 days. Another visited 6 times during a single month. The pattern mirrored what detectives had already seen in transaction records. But now they were watching it happen in real time. As surveillance continued, investigators compared observations against transaction submissions received through reporting databases. In several cases, the timing matched almost perfectly. A customer entered carrying electronics. Minutes later, inventory entries appeared in reporting systems. The transactions themselves became the focus. Detectives wanted to know whether proper verification procedures were actually being followed. State regulations required identification checks, transaction documentation, and detailed inventory records. Those requirements existed specifically to prevent stolen property from moving into legitimate resale channels. Investigators began looking for signs that those safeguards were being bypassed. To answer that question, undercover operations were authorized. Working under carefully controlled conditions, investigators entered the store posing as ordinary customers. Their purpose was not to entrap anyone. Instead, they were observing compliance procedures and documenting how transactions were handled. Reports later indicated that some interactions raised concerns. In several instances, employees appeared willing to process transactions with limited questioning regarding ownership history. Documentation procedures appeared inconsistent. Certain transactions moved unusually quickly. Investigators compared these observations against legal requirements and internal reporting obligations. The differences became difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, former employees continued speaking with detectives. Most described normal business practices. Some, however, recalled specific incidents that had bothered them at the time. One former worker described regular customers arriving with large quantities of electronics despite having no apparent business relationship with wholesalers or retailers. Another remembered privately questioning whether all merchandise had legitimate origins. When asked why concerns were never formally reported, responses varied. Some feared losing their jobs. Others assumed management had already conducted verification. Several admitted they simply didn't want to become involved. The interviews revealed something investigators frequently encounter in organizational misconduct cases. Warning signs had existed, but nobody wanted responsibility for confronting them. Then cooperating witnesses entered the picture, facing unrelated criminal charges. Several individuals agreed to provide information about how electronics moved through local resale markets. Their statements did not immediately prove criminal conduct. What they did provide was context. Names mentioned during interviews appeared in transaction records. Dates aligned with documented purchases. Description matched surveillance observation. For investigators, the significance was impossible to overlook. Independent sources were beginning to tell the same story. Inside the investigative workspace, evidence boards expanded across multiple walls. Surveillance photographs were added beside transaction histories. Witness statements were cross-referenced against financial records. Detectives highlighted recurring connections using colored markers and timeline charts. The investigation was no longer moving in separate directions. Every source of information was beginning to converge. Records matched observations. Observations matched witness accounts. Witness accounts matched inventory activity. The evidence ladder had advanced beyond suspicion and statistical patterns. Now investigators possessed something far more persuasive: visual confirmation. By late autumn, surveillance teams had accumulated weeks of observations. Investigators prepared detailed summaries documenting customer activity, transaction behavior, and recurring subjects connected to the store. Prosecutors reviewed the findings. Meetings stretched late into the evening. Conference rooms filled with binders, photographs, spreadsheets, and investigative reports. Detectives answered questions regarding timelines, compliance requirements, and evidentiary standards. The discussion focused on a single issue. Had the investigation established probable cause? By this stage, prosecutors believed the answer was yes. The records were extensive. The witness statements were consistent. The surveillance evidence supported investigative conclusions. Most importantly, separate categories of evidence reinforced one another. The theory investigators had been developing for months was no longer based on isolated incidents. It was supported by documentation, observations, and testimony. The next step will be the most significant move in the entire investigation. Applications for search warrants were prepared. Judges would soon review months of evidence gathered through financial analysis, transaction records, digital forensics, surveillance operations, and witness interviews. And when those warrants were finally executed, investigators would uncover evidence they had been searching for since the very first complaint landed on a detective's desk. The search warrants were approved after months of investigation. What had started as a handful of recovered electronics had grown into a case supported by financial records, transaction histories, digital forensic analysis, surveillance observations, and witness statements. Investigators now believed they had enough evidence to enter the business and determine whether the records matched what was actually inside. The operation began shortly after sunrise. Patrol units staged several blocks away, while investigators gathered in a municipal parking lot near the county administration building. Detectives reviewed assignments one final time. Evidence technicians prepared inventory equipment. Digital forensic specialists checked storage devices and imaging tools. The atmosphere was focused and quiet. Everyone understood the significance of the warrant. At 8:02 a.m., the first vehicles approached the pawn shop. Customers had already begun arriving. Some were waiting near the entrance. Others sat inside parked cars, scrolling through their phones. Most had no idea what was about to happen. The moment officers stepped from their vehicles, attention shifted immediately. Investigators identified themselves and secured the location. Employees inside the store froze. Several customers backed away from the counter. Others simply stood still, watching as detectives moved through the entrance carrying document cases and evidence containers. Security cameras captured the confusion. Store employees exchanged nervous looks. Questions started immediately. What's going on? Is somebody under arrest? What's this about? Officers provided only limited information. The warrant authorized the seizure of records and evidence. Beyond that, investigators remained careful about discussing the case publicly. Inside the store, teams spread out according to a pre-planned search strategy. The familiar electronics displays that customers had browsed for years suddenly became evidence. Every shelf, every storage cabinet, every computer terminal, everything was documented. Evidence technicians photographed display cases before touching anything. Inventory tags were compared against transaction records. Serial numbers were checked and logged. The process moved slowly, deliberately, methodically. Meanwhile, digital forensic specialists focused on the business systems. Computers behind the counter were secured. Hard drives were imaged. Point-of-sale databases were copied. Transaction records stored electronically were preserved for later analysis. The low hum of cooling fans mixed with the sound of keyboards and camera shutters. Investigators wanted a complete picture, not just of what the store possessed, but of how those items had entered the inventory system in the first place. As the search continued, additional teams executed warrants at related storage locations connected to the business. That discovery proved significant. Investigators located large quantities of electronics that were not immediately visible within the retail operation. Boxes containing phones, laptops, tablets, gaming systems, accessories. Many remained sealed inside storage containers waiting for examination. By midday, evidence logs had expanded dramatically. Items were cataloged one by one. Records were cross-referenced against existing investigative databases. The volume surprised even some members of the investigative team. What they were finding appeared consistent with the concerns that had been building throughout the case. The operation was larger than initially believed. As investigators worked, Marcus arrived at the scene. According to reports, he appeared confused at first, then increasingly concerned. Witnesses later recalled him standing near investigators while looking through the store windows toward the activity inside. For months, detectives had quietly gathered information. Now the investigation was impossible to ignore. Several detectives approached him outside. The conversation remained professional, short, procedural. Investigators informed him of the warrant and the nature of the search. Marcus reportedly denied knowingly purchasing stolen property. According to investigative summaries, he insisted that the business followed industry procedures and relied on customer-provided identification during transactions. The exchange remained calm, but investigators were no longer focused on explanations. They were focused on evidence. Over the following days, analysts reviewed materials seized during the searches. The findings accelerated the case. Transaction databases were compared against theft reports from multiple jurisdictions. Financial records were analyzed alongside inventory histories. Digital evidence recovered from business systems provided investigators with additional timelines and transaction details. The numbers continued growing. What had once appeared to be isolated incidents now seemed connected to a much broader operation. Investigators identified thousands of devices that required further examination. Many were legitimate. Others generated immediate concern. Serial numbers matched stolen property reports. Purchase histories aligned with theft timelines. Inventory movement corresponded with records investigators had already documented during surveillance operations. The separate pieces of evidence were beginning to fit together. For prosecutors, that distinction mattered. A single suspicious transaction could be explained away. Hundreds of similar transactions were much harder to dismiss. As evidence accumulated, formal charges were prepared. Prosecutors alleged that Marcus knowingly participated in a scheme involving stolen electronics entering the resale market through his business. The charging documents outlined transaction histories, financial benefits, inventory records, and investigative findings developed over the course of the case. The allegations quickly attracted public attention. Local news outlets obtained court filings. Television crews appeared outside the store. Newspaper headlines summarized months of investigative work in a few sentences. For many residents, the accusations came as a shock. Customers who had done business with Marcus for years struggled to reconcile the allegations with the person they believed they knew. Some publicly defended him. Others distanced themselves immediately. Former supporters stopped returning to the store. Community organizations quietly removed references to past partnerships. Online discussions became increasingly divided. The damage to the business was immediate. Even before the criminal case reached court, the store's reputation had begun collapsing. Foot traffic disappeared. Vendors became hesitant. Questions replaced trust. The business that had spent years building credibility was now associated with a criminal investigation spanning multiple jurisdictions. And yet, despite the arrests, the searches, the seized evidence, and the growing public scrutiny, prosecutors still faced a difficult challenge. Evidence alone would not guarantee a conviction. Every transaction, every recovered device, every witness statement, every financial record, every surveillance observation, all of it would need to be presented in a way that jurors could understand. Because proving the allegations in court would require prosecutors to connect every piece of evidence into one story. By the time the case reached court, investigators had spent more than a year assembling evidence. The search warrants had produced thousands of records. Digital evidence filled multiple storage drives. Financial documents occupied entire shelves inside the prosecutor's evidence room. Detectives had reconstructed transaction histories stretching back years. Now the challenge was different. The question was no longer whether investigators believed a crime had occurred. The question was whether prosecutors could explain the entire operation to 12 jurors. The trial began on a cold Monday morning inside the county courthouse. Security officers guided visitors through metal detectors. Court clerks moved stacks of paperwork between offices. The familiar sounds of a working courthouse echoed through the building. Closing doors, rolling evidence carts, quiet conversations in hallways. Inside the courtroom, Marcus sat beside his attorneys. Months earlier, he had been standing behind the counter of a successful business. Now he faced allegations that threatened to define the rest of his life. Prosecutors began by presenting the investigation itself. The first witnesses were detectives who had worked the case from the beginning. Jurors listened as investigators described how stolen electronics repeatedly surfaced through the same business. Theft reports from unrelated incidents had eventually converged on a single location. What initially appeared to be coincidence became a pattern, and eventually that pattern became an investigation. The prosecution carefully walked jurors through the timeline. Residential burglaries, vehicle break-ins, package thefts, retail theft incidents. Different victims, different suspects, different locations. Yet investigators repeatedly found stolen devices connected to the same inventory system. The evidence became increasingly technical. Financial analysts took the stand next. Using charts projected onto courtroom monitors, they explained how money flowed through the operation. Bank records, transaction histories, and inventory purchases were displayed for jurors. The testimony focused on one central issue: profit. According to prosecutors, electronics acquired at unusually low prices were frequently resold at substantial markups. The analysts explained how investigators identified recurring sellers and linked them to significant transaction volumes. Several jurors took notes. Others studied the spreadsheets displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. The prosecution's argument was simple. This was not a case involving isolated mistakes. It was a business model that allegedly generated revenue through suspicious acquisitions. Digital forensic specialists followed. For many jurors, their testimony became some of the most compelling evidence presented during the trial. Experts explained how serial numbers function as unique identifiers. They described how recovered devices could be tracked across multiple databases. They demonstrated how activation records, inventory logs, and transaction histories aligned. One by one, examples appeared on courtroom monitors. A stolen laptop reported by a burglary victim. A transaction recorded days later. A resale entry appearing shortly afterward. The process repeated across numerous devices. The pattern was difficult to ignore. Prosecutors then introduced surveillance evidence. Video footage gathered during the investigation showed recurring visitors entering the business carrying large quantities of electronics. Transaction records corresponding to those visits were displayed alongside surveillance timestamps. Jurors watched clips quietly. The courtroom remained largely silent, except for the soft hum of equipment and the occasional movement of chairs. The evidence was no longer theoretical. They were seeing portions of the investigation unfold in real time. Former employees provided another layer of testimony. Most described ordinary business operations, but several recalled concerns that emerged over time. One witness testified that certain transactions felt unusual because of the volume of electronics involved. Another described situations where questions regarding ownership appeared limited or rushed. The testimony was careful, measured, no dramatic accusations, just observations from people who had worked inside the business. Victims whose property had been recovered later took the stand. For prosecutors, their testimony helped personalize an investigation built largely on records and databases. A college student described losing a laptop containing coursework. A small business owner explained how stolen devices disrupted daily operations. Another victim recalled the frustration of discovering personal electronics had entered resale channels before recovery. The testimony shifted the emotional tone of the trial. The discussion was no longer limited to transaction histories. Jurors were hearing from people directly affected by the alleged conduct. The defense responded aggressively. Attorneys argued that the prosecution was attempting to transform negligence into criminal intent. They emphasized that pawn shops regularly encounter stolen property without knowing it. They challenged investigative assumptions. They questioned whether employees could realistically verify every item presented by customers. Several witnesses faced lengthy cross-examinations. Defense attorneys highlighted gaps in records and inconsistencies within certain timelines. At multiple points, they argued that prosecutors had failed to establish knowledge beyond a reasonable doubt. The central defense theme remained consistent. Poor procedures were not the same as criminal intent. Jurors spent days evaluating competing explanations. During breaks, observers watched them carefully. Some appeared engaged throughout technical testimony. Others maintained neutral expressions that revealed little. Predicting outcomes proved impossible. After closing arguments, the case finally reached deliberations. The wait felt endless. Hours turned into days. Inside the courthouse, families, attorneys, reporters, and investigators monitored every update. Then the jury returned. The courtroom filled quickly. The atmosphere changed the moment everyone took their seats. When the verdict was read, the room became completely silent. Jurors found Marcus guilty on multiple charges connected to the trafficking and resale of stolen electronics. Years of business records, surveillance evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis had ultimately convinced them. The investigation that began with a handful of recovered devices had ended in criminal accountability. Several weeks later, sentencing followed. By then, much of the public attention had shifted elsewhere. But inside the courtroom, the consequences were becoming final. Prosecutors emphasized the scale of the operation. Victims described lasting financial and personal impacts. Defense attorneys requested leniency, citing Marcus's business history and lack of prior serious criminal convictions. When the judge spoke, the courtroom remained quiet. The comments focused heavily on trust. Businesses operating within regulated systems carry responsibilities. Those responsibilities exist to protect communities, property owners, and consumers. According to the court, that trust had been violated. The judge ultimately imposed a substantial prison sentence along with financial penalties and restitution obligations. Marcus listened without visible reaction. Years of work had collapsed into a few moments of legal finality. The courtroom proceedings were over. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence had been imposed. But the consequences of the case would not end when the hearing concluded, because the damage left behind would continue long after the sentence was announced. The sentencing hearing marked the legal end of the case. But for many people affected by the investigation, it was only the beginning of dealing with the consequences. Long after the courtroom emptied, the impact continued spreading through the community. Some victims eventually recovered stolen property. Others never did. Many devices had been resold, dismantled, or moved through secondary markets before investigators identified them. For victims, the loss was never limited to the hardware itself. Family photographs, business records, school projects, financial documents, and personal information had disappeared along with the devices. Several victim statements filed with the court described lingering frustration. Even after the convictions, they were still dealing with the disruption caused by the thefts. The investigation also left a lasting mark on the local community. For years, Marcus's business had been viewed as a successful example of small business growth. Customers knew the staff. Local organizations accepted sponsorships. Residents recommended the store to friends and family. That reputation vanished quickly. News coverage of the case remained accessible online. Court records became public. Search results permanently connected the business to one of the largest stolen electronics investigations the region had ever seen. Former customers found themselves reevaluating years of interactions. Employees who had no involvement in the criminal conduct faced difficult questions about where they had worked. The collapse of trust extended far beyond the courtroom. Financial consequences followed. The business closed. Assets were liquidated through court proceedings and related legal actions. Equipment, inventory, and other property became part of lengthy recovery efforts involving creditors, victims, and government agencies. The economic damage spread outward. Former employees lost jobs. Vendors lost customers. Associated businesses lost revenue generated by the store's operations. What had once appeared to be a thriving enterprise became a cautionary example of how quickly financial success can disappear when misconduct is exposed. The case also attracted attention within the pawn industry itself. Trade organizations reviewed the investigation carefully. Industry professionals understood that most pawn shops operate legally and rely heavily on public trust. Cases involving stolen property can damage confidence in the entire sector. As a result, many businesses began reevaluating internal procedures. Some increased employee training. Others strengthened documentation requirements. Additional verification measures became more common. The goal was simple: reduce opportunities for stolen property to enter legitimate resale channels. Law enforcement agencies reached similar conclusions. Investigators involved in the case later reviewed how the operation had continued for so long without earlier intervention. The answer was not a single failure. It was a collection of small weaknesses. Separate theft reports remained disconnected for extended periods. Information sharing between agencies was inconsistent. Patterns existed long before anyone recognized them. In response, several departments modified monitoring procedures. Property crime units expanded database review practices. Analysts received additional training focused on identifying transaction trends. Information sharing systems were updated to improve communication between jurisdictions. Technology played a role as well. Enhanced reporting systems made it easier to compare stolen property reports against pawn transactions in near real time. Automated alerts helped investigators identify suspicious patterns more quickly than before. The improvements were not dramatic. Most occurred quietly, but they reflected lessons learned through the investigation. The case also highlighted an uncomfortable reality about accountability. Large-scale misconduct rarely survives because of a single failure. It survives because multiple safeguards break down at the same time. Employees fail to report concerns. Supervisors overlook warning signs. Systems generate alerts that nobody reviews. Questions remain unasked. The investigation revealed how those failures can accumulate gradually until they become impossible to ignore. Looking back, one of the most striking aspects of the case was the contrast between appearance and reality. Publicly, the business projected stability. Customers saw display cases filled with electronics. They saw employees helping shoppers. They saw a familiar local business operating like countless others. Investigators eventually saw something very different. Transaction histories, recovered devices, surveillance footage, financial records, witness statements. Viewed individually, none of those pieces told the entire story. Together, they revealed a pattern that prosecutors successfully presented in court. The difference between those two perspectives became the defining lesson of the case. Trust matters, but trust alone is never enough. Systems designed to protect communities depend on verification, oversight, and accountability. When those safeguards are ignored, manipulated, or treated as routine paperwork, the consequences can spread far beyond a single business. Years after the investigation concluded, the case continued appearing in law enforcement training discussions, industry compliance reviews, and presentations involving property crime investigations. Not because it was the largest case ever prosecuted, but because it demonstrated how ordinary transactions can conceal larger problems when nobody looks closely. The storefront is gone now. The display cases have been removed. The customers moved elsewhere. What remains are court records, investigative files, and the lessons left behind. A business that once relied on trust ultimately became known for violating it. And what began as a successful business ended as a cautionary example of how quickly trust can disappear when accountability finally arrives.